Multiparadigm Data Science with the Wolfram language. Section 4, Assembling a Multiparadigm Toolset. We started the course with the central idea of developing a multi-paradigm project workflow, incorporating ideas, algorithms, and techniques from across disciplines at different stages of the workflow to ensure it aims to answer data-driven questions. We've already looked at machine learning superfunctions like classify and predict to answer classification questions like is this A or B, or regression questions like how many or how much. Now let's move on to unsupervised machine learning to answer questions like how is the data organized? Does the data have some inherent structure? Do the samples sort themselves out into different groups and subgroups? Unsupervised learning functions attempt to automatically discover patterns in unlabeled data. Clustering is one of the most common unsupervised learning tasks, which attempts to partition the data into groups or clusters. Elements within a cluster are closer to each other than to other elements outside the cluster. For Fisher's iris data, if we cluster based on the numerical features of petal length and petal width, the clusters coincide very nicely with the species of the flower, the blue dots being setosa in a 2-cluster partition, and in a 3-cluster partition, the orange dots are versicolor and the green dots are virginica, mostly. In the Wolfram language, FindClusters can be used to partition a dataset into clusters of similar elements. It works on all sorts of data, numerical, text, image, as well as dates and times. To cluster any type of data, what we need is a measure of how far apart each sample is from other samples in the data, a way to measure the distance between. And for this, we need a distance function. A distance function f satisfies the following requirements. So identical element pairs have 0 distance and all others have positive distance. The greater the distance, the less the similarity between them. FindClusters automatically picks up a distance function depending on the type of data. If the EI are vectors of numbers, FindClusters by default uses squared Euclidean distance. If EI are lists of Boolean true and false elements, then FindClusters uses a dissimilarity based on the normalized fraction of elements that disagree. For example, Jacquard dissimilarity. If the EI are strings, then FindClusters by default uses a distance function based on the number of point changes needed to get from one string to another. For example, edit distance. We can also explicitly specify an appropriate distance function depending on the data. Here are some useful distance functions for numeric data, Boolean data, and string data. The choice of a distance function is definitely important in finding the right kind of clusters. Here's an example with synthetic data where changing the distance function from Euclidean to cosine allows the algorithm to find clusters which are obvious to the human eye. The other important choice for identifying clusters is the clustering algorithm itself. By default, FindClusters tries different methods and selects the best for clustering. K-means and K-medioids determine how to cluster the data for a particular number of clusters. dbScan, Jarvis-Patrick, mean shift, spanning tree, neighborhood contraction, and Gaussian mixture determine how to cluster the data without assuming a particular number of clusters. Agglomerate and spectral can be used in both cases. Certain clustering algorithms perform better than others depending on the natural clusters in the data. In this synthetic data, we humans can clearly identify the cluster embedded in the center of what appears to be uniformly distributed noise. The K-means clustering algorithm, however, attempts to find 2 clusters and does not work very well in this case, but the density-based spatial clustering algorithm dbScan can easily identify the cluster in the center. For more control on the clustering algorithm, we can specify method sub-options like neighborhood radius and neighbor's number for dbScan, initial centroids for K-means and K-medioids, and cluster dissimilarity function, which specifies the intercluster dissimilarity for the agglomerate method. The specified criterion function is used to evaluate the clusters obtained to decide on the best number of clusters. In this dataset, using standard deviation as a criterion function results in unnecessarily breaking up the outer ring cluster into multiple smaller clusters. However, using the R-squared criterion function, only 2 clusters are established. There are other Wolfram language functions that use the notion of distance function and can be used to group samples based on their similarity. Both clustering tree and dendrogram hierarchically create clusters and visualize them as well. While FindClusters returns the separate list of samples corresponding to each cluster, clustering components returns the indices of the clusters to which each sample belongs. The nearest function uses the notion of the distance function internally to find elements closest to a given sample. While working with samples in feature space, feature nearest can be used to create a nearest function that can be used to find a sample from the training data that is the closest match to a new test sample. We've looked at feature space plot before, briefly during exploratory data analysis. Given any collection of objects, feature space plot attempts to lay them out in an appropriate feature space without the need for fine-tuning details like converting data from one format to another, projecting to lower dimensions, or choosing algorithms and parameter values. Feature space plot can handle different types of data like photographs, text, etc., and use sophisticated pre-trained feature extractors internally. Label training data is expensive since an expert has to manually label each sample. However, unlabeled training data is abundant and easy to come by. If we view clusters found in unlabeled data as potential classes, then we can use clustering to build a classifier that will assign labels to new samples based on the clusters it has identified in the existing data. Here is a breast cancer dataset from the UCI machine learning repository consisting of benign and malignant samples with numerical features extracted from original images of the cells. These are the feature descriptions, and we see that the first column is the ID and the last column is the class. There are 458 benign and 241 malignant samples. So let's ignore the ID and the class columns. Let's just focus on columns 2 to 10. We can use these features and attempt to cluster the data and then build a classifier based on that clustering. So now once we have the classifier, we can use it on new samples to predict a potential class label, malignant or benign, for a new sample. Going back to the samples and applying our classifier, we find 2 class assignments where the first class has 385 samples, which look mostly like the benign samples, and the second class has 312 samples, which has 73 benign but 239 of the malignant samples. So we see that sometimes cheaper computational methods can serve as a screen for classifying samples that otherwise require expensive experimental methods for accurately classifying them. Of course, we can always use the experimental method to confirm the classification suggested by the computational method. Given a large amount of data, it is possible to create a simple interpretable model of how the data was generated. The Wolfram language function LearnDistribution learns a distribution from the data that attempts to represent an underlying process from which the examples might have been generated. Back to Fisher's iris data, we can train a distribution directly from this dataset and use it to generate random samples. Here is a comparison of the generated random samples in red against the original samples in green. For the simpler case of univariate data, the related function FindDistribution attempts to learn a continuous or discrete distribution from the data itself. Here's a histogram of data points generated from a mixture of normal distribution and exponential distribution. FindDistribution suggests this mixture distribution to fit the data and we can see how the fit compares with the histogram itself. In summary, we looked at FindClusters as the primary function for cluster analysis in the Wolfram language. We looked at choices of distance function and algorithms that can be used with FindClusters. And we also looked at CriterionFunction as an option to evaluate clusters and select the right number of clusters automatically. Other functions that can be used to visualize clusters in the data or to find samples closer to a specific data point are clustering tree, dendrogram, clustering components, feature space plot, nearest, and feature nearest. In the absence of labeled training samples, ClusterClassify can be used to build a classifier from a clustering of unlabeled samples, using the clusters as potential classes. Finally, we also looked at LearnDistribution and FindDistribution as ways of learning a distribution from the data itself to represent the underlying process that generated the samples.